This is the podcast of The Branch in Ashland, Virginia. One of the things that we see in the Old Testament is that the Hebrew people celebrated festivals and had celebrations that would last for days. And within those celebrations, there was meaning woven throughout. What they celebrated was constantly pointing them back to a deeper meaning. And that was certainly seen in the celebration of the Passover, as well as the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. God gave them these things as ordinances to last throughout generations, to teach of His goodness and His faithfulness. Generations later, having passed these traditions on, Jesus added new meaning to these celebrations when He pointed to the work that He would do on the cross, fulfilling the requirement of a perfect, unblemished, and spotless blood sacrifice permanently. Today we look at the origin of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and we ask ourselves questions about how we pass on and celebrate the significant things that God has done in our lives to the next generation.
I did an experiment this week on social media, asking questions about different senses that we have and whether they kind of evoke memories for us. I think, and it was interesting to read some of what people posted, that generally there were smells and there were tastes and there were sights that would evoke memories from people's childhoods. It seems like we really associate memories with certain senses that we have. I don't know if you, some of you are friends with me on social media, and you may have seen that, but I wonder if you've had that experience before where you have associated memories based on certain senses that you have. I grew up, we didn't have a ton of money, and so our vacations that I took as a child, they were mostly road trips. And since I grew up in New England, we always went south. So my dad went to college in South Carolina, so we would visit friends who were like family there. We had family in Georgia. We had family in Florida as well. And because we didn't have a ton of money, my mom would always pack a cooler with whatever food we were going to be eating on that trip. We also never really went to fast food restaurants when I was a kid, and we didn't really drink soda that often. So I always knew it was going to be a special occasion to drink soda. And so my mom would pack this cooler, and we would stop at rest areas, and we'd be sitting, at the picnic table there. And for whatever reason, we always had Mountain Dew there. So anytime that I taste Mountain Dew, I can close my eyes and I can hear the trucks rushing past on the highway, and I feel like I'm sitting at a rest area picnic table eating a sandwich that my mom had made. Not only road trips, but around Christmas time, I can close my eyes and I can see the green carpet that in my parents' living room. I can hear the crackle of the record player as it played Andy Williams' Christmas or the Carpenters' Christmas, and then I can smell the chocolate crinkle cookies my mom would make, and the sugar cookies, or the Spritz cookies that she would make, if you know what Spritz cookies are. But it's amazing to me how memories can be so connected to our senses that when we have certain smells and tastes and sights, that they can bring us right back to that place. And I think there's something powerful about memories that are associated with senses, because every time, it's hard for us to forget when those memories are so deeply connected to senses that we have. And I think God knows that. And so in the Bible, we see different senses connected to memories and remembrances. And as we continue in our study of the book and are looking through the book of Exodus, we see that today in how God connected celebration with a meal, and specifically with the Feast of Unleavened Bread that the Jewish people, the Hebrew people in the Old Testament celebrated together. So if you have a Bible, you can turn with me to Exodus chapter 12. We're going to be reading two different sections, but for right now, Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 17. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month you're to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses, and anyone, whether foreign or native born, who eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the door frame. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he'll see the blood on the top and sides of the door frame will pass over that doorway, and he'll not permit the destroyer to enter your house and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you, tell them it's a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. And the people bowed down and worshiped. And the Israelites did just what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. Now, these first instructions here are to this Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the feast was a reminder to the Hebrew people of how quickly they needed to leave Egypt. God had told Moses to go be his representative, to tell Pharaoh, hey, you need to let my people go. And after countless times of God Moses saying that to Pharaoh, Pharaoh finally relinquished and let the people go. And so they had to hustle. They had to get out of there quickly. And so this unleavened bread, there was no time for the bread to rise, the dough to rise. And so this was an example to them and a reminder to them in this meal, in this festival, of what God had done for them. You know, it's interesting because I think over the years, as I've seen sort of the evolution of holidays, that what started out as one thing has evolved into something else. And I think that there can be a tendency sometimes for us to celebrate a holiday without even remembering what we're celebrating. You know, we just passed Memorial Day, and I have really distinct memories of Memorial Day as well. My dad he was pastor of a church in New England, and it was a small town, kind of like Ashland. We had a Memorial Day parade, and it always ended at the cemetery and the veteran section of the cemetery. And my dad would sing God Bless America and other patriotic tunes at this service that they held. And sometimes I have to take a step back in the midst of celebrating things like Memorial Day or Veterans Day, even the bigger holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas, and remember what it is that I'm celebrating. Because sometimes if I walk into a store, I can easily be derailed from what it is I'm celebrating. And God forbid that you actually want to wait until a few weeks before to really think about the holiday, because as soon as one's done, they just hit you in the face with the next one, right? But I wonder, when we connect senses to and certain meals to holidays, can we remember what it is that we're celebrating? Instead of getting caught up in certain things that take us away and distract us from the real celebration, the real meaning behind something, how can we keep the meaning there? God told his people to celebrate this Feast of Unleavened Bread as a lasting ordinance or a law, that they would have to keep doing this over and over and over again. And it wasn't just for them, but it was for future generations as well. That as they celebrated that, it would be a reminder to them and a reminder to others of what God had done, of his faithfulness throughout every generation. There was this feast that was associated with God's rescuing and redemption of his people. And, it's funny because God knows how short-sighted we can be and how easily we can forget either what it is that we're celebrating or that we're supposed to celebrate to begin with. And so giving this as an ordinance, as a law, to say, hey, celebrate this regularly and don't forget why you're celebrating it. Because as you take this unleavened bread and you're reminded of how quickly you had to leave Egypt, and you think about Passover as well, connected here with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it will remind you of God's faithfulness to you throughout the generations. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was actually one of 3 pilgrimage festivals that the Hebrew people celebrate. A pilgrimage festival was a festival where people would go back to Jerusalem, the holy city, the city of David, where they needed to go back there to celebrate what God was doing and to celebrate and remember the grace and redemption that they had received and that their people had received throughout every generation. And this was not a celebration to be done individually. This was a communal thing. That's the significance of community when it comes to the people of God. Because there's something that happens together in celebration when we come together. I think that's one of the things that was so hard for so many of us throughout 2020 was that community felt broken and we felt like we couldn't come together. Coming together, whether it be on Sundays or other times, it's significant not because that's what the church has to do, but because God created us for community. God created us to come together. And when we come together, we can remind each other of God's grace and his faithfulness. We can remind each other of just how good God is in the midst of it. Moses had warned Pharaoh when he'd gone to tell him that God told him to let his people go, that if he didn't comply, if he didn't obey, then plagues would come upon Egypt. And because Pharaoh didn't comply, that's exactly what happened. There was a plague of blood. There was the plague of frogs. There was the plague of gnats. The plague of flies. The plague on the livestock. The plague of boils. The plague of hail. The plague of locusts. And the plague of darkness. And finally, the worst of all the plagues to come was that last plague, which was the plague of the firstborn. That while some of these things were temporary and they were nuisances, frogs and gnats and boils and other things, this was something that was more permanent. That the lasting impact of the plague of the firstborn was going to be so great that Pharaoh would have no choice but to say, okay, I'm done. I'll give in. And so looking into the next chapter in Exodus, chapter 13. Again, if you have your Bibles, you can turn, and it'll be here on the screen. Starting in verse 1 of Exodus 13, we read about this. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male, the first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal." And Moses said to the people, "Commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with a mighty hand. Eat nothing containing yeast. Today in the month of Aviv, you're leaving. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites, the land he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you are to observe this ceremony in this month. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, and on the seventh day hold a festival to the Lord. Eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. Nothing with yeast in it is to be seen among you, nor shall any yeast be seen anywhere within your borders. On that day tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that this law of the Lord is to be on your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand. You must keep this ordinance as the appointed time year after year. And after the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and gives it to you, as he promised on oath to you and your ancestors, you're to give over to the Lord the first offspring of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. In days to come, when your sons ask you, what does this mean? Say to him, with a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, and out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed the firstborn of both people and animals in Egypt. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring of every womb and redeem each of my firstborn sons. And it'll be like a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead that the Lord brought us out of Egypt with his mighty hand. You know, Passover was a brutal and a bloody event. And we read about it in chapter 12. You think about what that would do as you're taking hyssop and you're dipping it in the blood and you're putting it on the door frame of your house. And yet, what does it point to? Passover required a sacrifice. In order that God would pass over the house, blood was required to be shed. It can go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, where we see Adam and Eve fall. And as soon as they disobeyed God and ate from the tree that God had instructed them not to eat from, they realized their nakedness and they needed to cover over their shame. And what did God do? God supplied skins for them. Well, where did those skins come from? An animal needed to be killed. It needed to be slaughtered in order that that skin could be given to Adam and Eve, and that they would be covered over from their nakedness. They'd be covered over from their shame. And from that point on, that was God's way of bringing redemption and covering to his people, was through the shedding of blood. And here we see it again in the Passover that happened with this 10th plague that came to Egypt. And Jesus eventually came to be that sacrifice. You know, here a firstborn was sacrificed or was redeemed. And that points also to the fact that Israel is God's firstborn. There's something about the firstborn that they're special, that they're elevated. Especially in the Bible, we see this, that the firstborn were given double portions, and the firstborn were the ones to carry on the name of the people. And by God pointing out this firstborn, he's also talking about the fact that Israel is his firstborn. And it's through the firstborn of God's people that the world can be redeemed. Not only because God's chosen a people for himself, but it was through that line that Jesus eventually came. That Jesus came and then he became the sacrifice so that we would never have to sacrifice again. He became the one whose blood was shed. And if you read through the specifics of the sacrifice, that all those that were sacrificed needed to be without blemish, perfect in every way, spotless. Only a perfect sacrifice could be used, which is what Jesus eventually became for us and for his people. If you've ever had the opportunity, or if you ever do have the opportunity to take part in a Passover Seder, I would highly encourage it. I remember there was a man in our church growing up who had become a Christian, yet he had practiced Passovers forever since he was raised in a Jewish family. And just seeing some of the elements of that, what we're talking about with connecting a meal and a memory together and saying, oh, okay, so that's what that means. Oh, that's what that means. And so I would really encourage you that, of course, nowadays you could probably go on YouTube and look it up and see something, see somebody celebrating that. But you see the different elements and begin to connect those to not only the sacrifice that was required, but also what God has done in pointing and paving the way to Jesus, who would eventually be that sacrifice for us. Once the destroyer saw the blood that was on the doorpost, he would pass over that house. And it was only the houses with the blood of the innocent lamb that he would pass over. But blood was required to redeem the firstborn of the children and the livestock. And eventually, again, like I said, God would show to the people what would come through the firstborn of his people, Israel. We see in chapter 13 of Exodus 2 these instructions about how to celebrate this feast, this festival, how to remember in the midst of what they were celebrating. And it wasn't just about doing it then and in that moment for those who were celebrating it, but it was done so that it would evoke questions from those who are watching. Any of us who have raised kids or been around kids know that that's what kids do. They ask questions. They ask why. Why are you doing that? What's that for? Some of us have earned the stripes that we have with our own children, having to answer those questions over and over and over again. And God knew that and set up this celebration so that the children would see it and say, why are you doing that? Like, what's up with the blood? Why the lamb? And then God said, then tell the next generation. Not just, oh yeah, I'm putting blood of lamb on here, but why? Why did God instruct you to do this? And as we do that, we pass on to the next generation God's faithfulness. We pass on the story of God's redemption and grace. It was a reminder to them and to the next generation of all that God had done. With the expectation that kids will ask questions, being prepared to have an answer to tell them about the story of God and what he's done. What are the legacies that we pass on to our children? And what are the legacies of faith that we pass on? What are the things that we've created? I think that we celebrate things whether we're doing it consciously or not. And I wonder when the next generation, whether they're our own children or spiritual children, when they look at the things that we celebrate, what do they see? I think there's a lot of people who are crazy into sports, and there are so many celebrations around sports. And I think it's fine that we do that, but if we do that and then we forget to celebrate the story of God in festivals and celebrations, what does that say to the next generation? What does that say to those who come behind us? Do we let them know, or do we tell them, even if it's indirectly, that, hey, sports are more important than what God has done for me? And so how are we setting up the next generation, and how are we training them to know the story of God and their part in it? And so what do we do with all this? I think the first question we can ask ourselves is what's God done for you that you could memorialize in a meal or a celebration or a party? It's not just, for the Hebrew people, it was the Passover. It was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But all of us who have have encountered or who Jesus has pursued and drawn to the Father have a story about what God has done. All of us who have been through a spiritual journey and are on the spiritual journey can point to different markers along the way of what God has done. How are we passing that to the next generation? How are we celebrating that and saying, hey, can I tell you about what happened on this date? I mean, there are people here who, I love it because I don't always remember, but they'll say to me, hey, you know what this week is? This was the week that, I finally stood up in front of people and said, hey, can I tell you about what God did? And they remember those things. They've memorialized these significant dates in their lives in such a way that every time the calendar turns to that date, they can say, hey, I remember this date because it was on this date that God did something significant in my life. And so I wonder, are we celebrating those moments? Are we keeping them to ourselves? One of the reasons why we have community is to celebrate those things together, is to say, hey, let me tell you about what God did on this date 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And then how are we training our children? And just because you've raised your children are grown, that doesn't give you a pass, because I think part of the requirement of us in community is to have spiritual children as well, that we disciple others in the faith. So how are we training others up to know the story of God and their part in it? I think as we begin to memorialize and celebrate and have feasts around the significant things that God has done in our lives, we can pass that on to the next generation to let them say, okay, well, how can I celebrate what God's done in my life? Whether it's baptism or actual conversion or whatever it might be. What are the things that we do to celebrate those significant mile markers of God's grace and redemption in our lives?
So what do we celebrate? And how do we celebrate it? How do next generations, the generations that come, know that these are the things that are important to us? Because they see it in what we celebrate and how we celebrate it. It's so important to make sure that we mark and remember what God has done for us. As followers of Jesus, ones who would consider ourselves to be disciples, we should be seeing God's faithfulness and His mercies new each morning. Do we stop and acknowledge and celebrate what God has done and what God is doing? How do we let others know of the goodness of God in our celebrations? So how are you going to celebrate what God has done for you in such a way that the next generation sees, wonders, and asks about it? So let's go and celebrate God's faithfulness in our own lives and in such a way that the next generation accepts the invitation to be part of God's story in their own lives as well. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you have any comments or questions, please email us at thebranchashland@gmail.com. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks again for listening.